Welcome to our panel discussion titled The Effects of the COVID-19 Crisis on Criminal Violence and Public Security in Latin America. My name is Elena Rodriguez, and I'm the Program Manager for the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at the University of Michigan. We're so very happy to have you all here today. As you know, during the last 8 or 9 months, our center has been deeply missing the joy that comes with interacting in person with our on-campus community. But I'm so heartened to see that through these Zoom webinars, we're now able to connect with scholars, students, and members of different communities all across the US, Latin America, and beyond. So I hope that wherever you find yourself today, that you're safe and healthy, and I thank you for sharing your time with us. By now, many of us are familiar with the Zoom format for these kinds of events, but I'd like to briefly go over the webinar functions today. As attendees, your mics and videos are muted and we've disabled the chat box. However, we invite you to submit questions to our moderator through the Q&A box, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. Those questions will be visible to only the panelists, and our moderator will present them during the Q&A portion of the event after all of our panelists speak. When you submit a question, please include your institutional affiliation and whether you are a student, faculty, or hold another position. All right, let's move along. Today's panel was made possible with funding from a Title VI National Resource Center grant from the U.S. Department of Education and with generous support of our co-sponsors. So I want to thank the University of Michigan's Department of Political Science, the Ford International Policy Center, and the Conflict and Peace Research and Development Group for their co-sponsorship. And of course, most of all, I want to thank our moderator today for spearheading this effort and bringing together such a wonderful group of scholars from whom you will hear shortly. So let me introduce our moderator now. Edgar Franco-Vivanco is a Michigan Institute for Data Science and National Center for Institutional Diversity postdoctoral fellow here at the University of Michigan. His research explores how colonial era institutions and contemporary criminal violence shape economic underperformance, particularly within Latin America. His dissertation-related book project studies the role indigenous groups have played in the state-building process of the region since colonial times. Using extensive archival data of colonial Mexican courts, combined with automated text analysis, he examines the complex interactions between indigenous communities and the colonial state. Edgar's research on contemporary challenges to development focuses on criminal violence and policing. And he's co-authoring a book that draws upon extensive fieldwork in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, to study the differentiated effects of state interventions against organized criminal groups. We're so grateful to have Dr. Franco-Vivanco moderating today. And with that, I'll let him speak more about the panel topic and introduce our panelists. Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. It's really a great pleasure to welcome you to this event. Today, I'm very happy to also welcome 4 amazing scholars who are also really dear colleagues of mine. They are going to help us today to reflect on how the COVID crisis has destabilized Latin America, specifically addressing the topics of violence, the relationship of criminal organization with the state, and also police violence, which, as we, many of us already knew, these were already really pressing problems in the region before 2020. And definitely the pandemic has raised new challenges and new questions that are going to define the future of Latin America. So I think that this panel is really a great opportunity to reflect on these issues, as I said, and also the ways in which violence scars the lives of thousands of people every day and every year. So today we have with us Rebecca Hanson of the University of Florida, Sandra from the Center for Research and Teaching in Economics, Eduardo Moncada from Barnard College at Columbia University, and also, unfortunately, Beatriz Magaloni had a last-minute emergency. She cannot be with us today. But also we are fortunate enough to have with us Alberto Diaz-Cayeros, who is a really close collaborator of her, and is also been doing a lot of interesting work on how the COVID crisis has affected criminal violence and the region in general. And again, thank you so much for being here, and welcome to the University of Michigan, at least in a virtual setting. Just a couple of logistic points. Each speaker is going to have about 15 minutes. And then at the end, we're going to have about 30 minutes for Q&A. And as Alana mentioned, if, you can start raising your questions in the Q&A section at the bottom. And I will try to collect all of them. And then at the end, bring them up to our speakers. So our first speaker is going to be Rebecca Hanson, who is an assistant professor of crime, law, and governance at the University of Florida, with a joint appointment in the Department of Sociology, the Department of Criminology and Law, and the Center for Latin American Studies. She has published research on Venezuela in the Journal of Latin American Studies, the Sociological Quarterly, among others. She has also published extensively in outlets such as the Christian Science Monitor, The Conversation, and the Inside Crime. Her book is titled Harassed: Gender Bodies and Ethnographic Fieldwork, which is co-authored with Patricia Richards of the University of Georgia. And that the book was published last year in the University of California Press. With that, Rebecca, you have the floor. Welcome.
Great, thank you so much. I hope everyone can hear me okay. So what I'll start doing is just go ahead and share my screen to make sure I get that up okay. So that the PowerPoint should be up now. So first, of course, I want to start off by thanking Edgar and Alana, as well as the Center for Latin American Caribbean Studies for organizing this really fantastic panel and for inviting me to be a part of this conversation with such an incredible group of scholars. So thank you so much. I want to preface before getting into the presentation, I'll give you a little bit of context for where the data is coming from. So a lot of this data is based on multiple projects that I've been working on with Veronica Zubillaga and Francisco Sanchez, as well as a couple of other colleagues in Venezuela. And we've been working on these projects together since about 2018. This wonderful photo is actually one of Francisco's photos that he's taken during field work. But of course, the COVID data is much more preliminary. So just to have that in mind as we work through the presentation. So sorry, I have something pulled up that I need to get rid of. There we go. All right, so it's probably unnecessary to give a broad overview. As many of you are probably aware of, that Venezuela has been in the news consistently over the past few years for a lot of political and economic turmoil. So some of the things that we've been seeing in the news is this consistent reference to the humanitarian crisis that has been occurring in the country that has really made it difficult to access just the most basic goods. And this, of course, has produced a massive refugee crisis of people fleeing out of Venezuela. So if it's not the country least prepared to deal with a health pandemic and subsequent lockdown, it's at least one of them, because the health system, of course, was already in shambles before all of this hit. So within this context, COVID cases were detected in March, as we can see here. Oh, sorry. As we can see here, but really started to rise in June and July. And so as of September, about 61,000 cases have been reported. This is surely higher, given the way the counting has occurred. So before jumping into the case that I'm going to be talking about most specifically, I do want to highlight that there's a lot of really important variation in terms of the way that COVID has affected crime and criminal organizing in the country. And I'd be happy to talk more about this variation in the Q&A. Andres Antillano and his colleagues have been doing some really great field work that I can discuss if people are interested in that. So keeping this variation in mind, I do want to focus on one particular trend among criminal groups that we've been documenting over the past few years through our research with police, community members, and gang members. And so this trend I'm going to be talking about is the move from very small, localized gangs who are battling over small patches of territory towards much more consolidated, organized, and coordinated criminal groups. So what we are thinking about is how COVID has highlighted this trend and is most likely contributing to this transition in certain places. And what we're also thinking about is how this trend can really help us to understand how a fragile and fragmented state has survived even pre-COVID, and how quarantines have been enforced despite a lack of state coordination and capacity. So to a certain degree, as you'll see throughout the presentation, the ability or the capacity to enforce a quarantine has actually been the result of some unintended consequences of state security policy. So it might sound a little bit strange to some of you to refer to the Venezuelan state in this way, since it usually tends to be portrayed as a very traditional authoritarian regime with really intense control over its populations, right? But as my work with Veronica and David Smiley, and we discussed this in an edited volume that we just finished, and I look at more closely in my project on policing during the revolution, the state has clearly, during the Bolivarian Revolution, become increasingly fragmented, fractured, and internally conflictive. Since the mid-2000s, the country has been recognized as one of the most violent countries in the world, though there's, of course, subnational variation that's often ignored that's important to keep in mind. But despite all of this, the crippling economic crisis, decreased state capacity, violence has actually been going down in the country over the past few years. And again, this is before COVID hits. You can see the graph here, the one on topping the all violent deaths put together. So they're, of course, still very high, but it's still an impressive decline considering what the rates have been previously. This is a little bit more focused of a look at how violent deaths have been declining in the country over the past few years. This is specifically looking at parroquias or parishes in Caracas. The numbers in red are some of the more violent parroquias. So if you look at Petare, for example, you can see that in 2017, there were 212 violent deaths, whereas in 2020, there are 105. So again, still very high, but has been cut in half. So the Ministry of Justice, of course, attributes this decrease in violent deaths to the success of their incredibly violent police raids that I'm going to talk a little bit about in a bit. But the research that I've been doing with Veronica and other people suggests a very different reason. So in short, what our research suggests is that changes in criminal organizations in some parts of the country, partly incentivized by militarized police initiatives, have become increasingly coordinated and settled. And this is really important for understanding political power as well as governance during the pandemic. So I'm going to talk about this process as being very well illustrated by a zone of the city that I'm going to refer to as El Mirador, a zone that's located in the center-south periphery of the city. So as you can see, it's built up on the side of a mountain, so it has a very good view over Caracas. The zone is largely governed by a group whose leader I'll refer to as Roni in this talk. So in July, when we asked Vanessa, community leader and long-term participant in Veronica's study on armed actors in this community, we were asking her about how things were with the quarantine. And she told us Roni's gang were the ones in charge of making sure that people complied with the quarantine. They came through with horns through each community, ordering everyone to get inside their houses. So at least around this sector, these days have been very complicated because you have to be very careful. They would come down armed, saying everyone inside with a horn and all that. There was even a boy who was shot in a sector higher up, shot in the foot for this reason, for this issue with the masks. And so this quote obviously sounds very similar to some of the reports that have been published by the Brookings Institute and news reports that have been coming out of Colombia, Brazil, and Mexico. But what I want to emphasize here is that Venezuela is very unlike these places, and that historically there really have been no cartels, no militias, really no well-organized armed actors with territorial sovereignty. In fact, early on in my dissertation research in 2012, police officers described gangs with 10 to 15 members as a large gang. And this is arguably one of the reasons why violence has been so high in the country, because gangs are so small and uncoordinated. And so we can contrast this with Roni's gang, which is estimated to have around 300 members and have alliances with at least 36 other sectors. And so what I'm going to do throughout the rest of the talk is really embed the relationship of COVID and some armed actors in the country in a recent historical context. And to be able to do that, we kind of have to jump back to 2015, which is 2 years after President Nicolas Maduro has been elected president following the death of Hugo Chavez. His first few years were marked by a lot of political turmoil and started off with this unprecedented economic crisis that I mentioned very briefly at the beginning of the presentation. His fate was very far from secure in terms of his political future. Government legitimacy was incredibly tattered, and trust that Chavismo was working for the interests of the poor had really dissolved. And so as country leaders have long done when facing a crisis of hegemony, he turns to generating fear of internal enemies and attacking these through really spectacular displays of police and military force. And so this begins with the Operación de Liberación del Pueblo in 2015, or the OLP, which I'll refer to it as in the rest of the presentation. Now, the OLP was eventually deployed throughout the rest of the city, but the first really spectacular display of it occurred in El Mirador. So to start, so this is like when we start to see these really terrifying images of military police raids in this area, somewhat reminiscent of what you see in Brazil, but this is, again, very different like image of policing in Venezuela in the media. And one police officer that I talked to estimated over 200 operativos or raids had been deployed in this area over the course of just 1 year. So the OLP was launched initially in this place to recover territorial sovereignty from gangs that had actually been strengthened by previous militarized raids that had been implemented. So you can see on this chart that each year that one of these plans is implemented, 2009, 2011, and 2013, there's an increase in the incarcerated population. But the OLP marks what Veronica and I have referred to as a turn from carceral punitivism to a more systematic killing of those identified as a threat to social order, meaning the bodies of poor Black and brown men, but also their families. And so integral to this turn that we talk about, as Leonard Gomez and I have shown through interviews with about 100 police officers, has been a change in internal policy within certain police forces, not all, but within a few, from an understanding that the police have a right to kill to an order to kill, or what the police refer to as a luz verde. So for a couple of different reasons, it's difficult to actually know how many people have been killed during these raids, but we do see a clear uptick in killings by state security forces after 2015. So Kemer Avila has shown between 2015 and 2016 that the number of people that have been killed by state security forces during that time period increased by 88%, which is pretty astounding. So basically what we're observing in places like El Mirador is this unconditional repression, to use Ben Lessing's term, which has incentivized an increase in organizational capacity. We see gangs starting to work together, taking over larger swaths of territory. And this is, of course, what research by Cruz and Duran Martinez would predict, right? So even the police officers that we interviewed about this process, who we would expect probably to defend the raids or at least remain quiet on them, given the culture of silence that we know permeates the police as an institution, officers actually noted that rather than fighting crime, the raids had strengthened criminal organizations from their perspective. So now I'm going to fast forward 2 years into the future, but keep in mind that during this 2-year period, there's just an incredible amount of conflict between police and state security forces and gangs. And so both police officers and gang members that we've talked to refer to this period as a period of warfare. And it's very common that grenades and military grade weapons are being used, or high caliber weapons are being used during these confrontations, right? So what happens in 2017 is that there's some political events that alter this conflict, principally a highly contested election that was supported by the government and then produced widespread anti-government protests against the elections, in which at least 130 people were killed. So in an attempt to calm the streets, as one gang member from the zone put it, high-ranking state officials began negotiating with gang leaders in order to be able to produce some degree of peace in the city. And so the way he put it is that hubo una palabra, there was a word, an agreement between the government and Ronnie, as well as some other gang leaders. And so as you can see here, there are even news stories about the pactos that were being made. So what we do is, what we see is we move from a situation in which an all-out war is being described between state security forces and then gangs being police being ordered out of the area. And this kind of new policy, this new stance on what police could do in these places was put on full public display in July of 2019 when officers from the forensic police, the CCPC, attempted to arrest a member of Ronnie's gang in El Mirador. So news outlets reported that after this intense confrontation, officers were actually ordered by the Ministry of Justice to retreat and leave the area, rather than continue advancing. We can also see some of the impacts of the these packs in looking at, if we look at the number of people who were killed by grenades in Caracas, as well as in the zone that I've been talking about more specifically today, Mirador. 2014 shouldn't actually be on this slide, I apologize, but as you can see, there's a clear peak in 2016 and just a dramatic decrease in 2017 and 2018. And so I'm going over this history because it's really essential to explaining how some criminal organizations have increasingly become akin to something like governors in their zones to be able to implement something like a quarantine, right? So Ronnie is even referred to in interviews and informal conversations as un ministro, and of course it's become key to enforcing the quarantine in this place. So what has come out of some of the interviews that we've done is that at the beginning he implemented things like checkpoints at the entryways of neighborhoods. He put out large dispensers of hand sanitizer, which were and are still very difficult to come by. There was a distribution of masks, disinfectants, and Clorox. There was a designation of certain homes where food could be sold out of, so people didn't have to leave their houses to get food. And then even after 3 months, the restrictions were relaxed, but there was still a curfew that was implemented. There was still the required use of masks and a suspension of certain other activities. And so the status of this idea of Ronnie as ministro really grabbed our attention because even though his organization, like others in the city, has seen a reduced revenue stream due to the crisis, as we've seen with news stories across the region, the bread and butter of this gang is extortion, kidnapping, and car theft. What we see is his political status and power in the area being really enhanced by the lockdown. And we can see this with the most basic provision of goods, such as food. So in another interview that we had with Vanessa, she's talking about CLAP meetings, which CLAP is a acronym for food distribution committees that are promoted by the government that give out food boxes with basic foodstuffs. And so she's talking about this and says, Ronnie even goes to the CLAP meetings. A few months ago, someone I knew told me, they called me for a CLAP meeting and it ended up that Ronnie was there in a CLAP meeting. But you know, he's the minister around here. Everything goes through him. CLAP boxes arrive and they tell the CLAP folks how many boxes are theirs, how many to distribute by sector. He's in charge of distributing them through his gang. And our ethnographic notes also suggest that Ronnie's group has been strengthened during the pandemic in other ways. For example, according to one community member, the number of gang members has increased during the pandemic, which is perhaps unsurprising given the lack of employment opportunities. And then the risk of engaging in criminal activity right now has actually required further internal strengthening. So on the one hand, in some places, in some parts of the city, these militarized police raids have actually led to temporary disruption among smaller criminal gangs. But on the other, we see this production of an overall trend of settling in Caracas and other cities and regions. So even in places like 23 de Enero, which is where there are some armed community organizations that are often referred to as colectivos, where these were founded decades ago, and thus they are much more organized than groups in other parts of the city. Even with them, we see that COVID seems to be incentivizing some degree of coordination, as well as situating them as essential access points for food during the humanitarian crisis. So during one of Francisco's visits to El 23, Carolina told him, Las cuadrillas de paz were created to deal with people on COVID. So what are these things? These are various colectivos under the same name. They walk, they surveil everywhere, and this benefits the government. It's as if it was one of these businesses from someone in the government. So don't go thinking that these huge trucks of food are given out freely. The pandemic has made plata or money. Think about how many businesses there are here, how many checkpoints the police put up, how much food is being moved. They don't need to sell crack or anything like that. La comida es el tiro. So here we see that in the context of a devastating humanitarian crisis where control over food distribution, really it has become political power. These groups and the agreements that we've seen being made and their association, although clandestine and inconsistent with the state, really represents a key mechanism of governance. And so I'll stop there. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Rebecca. This is really fascinating, and I think your research is going to be really important to understand how both the state and criminal groups are using this opportunity to increase their reach, and it's really the population that is caught in between here. I hope we can talk more about this in Q&A. For now, our next speaker is Sandra Ley. She's an assistant professor at the Political Studies Division at the Center for Research and Teaching in Economics, CIDE, in Mexico City. Prior to her arrival to CIDE, she was visiting fellow at the Kellogg Institute for International Studies at the University of Notre Dame. Sandra studies criminal violence and political behavior. Her research focuses on the political consequences of criminal activity, and her more recent work examines how violence affects the activation of civil society, political participation, and accountability. Together with Guillermo Trejo from the University of Notre Dame, she is the co-author of the book Votes, Drugs, and Violence, The Political Logic of Criminal Wars in Mexico, that was just published this year in Cambridge University Press. Her work has also been published in many other international outlets, such as the British Journal of Political Science and Comparative Political Studies. With that, Sandra, please, you're up.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Edgar, for the opportunity to join this discussion today. I'd like to thank also Alana Rodriguez for all the organization invitation to make this possible. I am grateful also for the chance to share the next hour or so with dear and admired friends and colleagues. And I'm happy to see that we're going to have some very important points in common to discuss throughout the Latin American region. My research focuses, as Edgar was saying, on the Mexican case, and I will focus on discussing some features that I hope can help understand how Mexico entered the COVID-19 pandemic and how an already ongoing security crisis intertwined with the pandemic, along with other parallel features regarding security that we might need to pay attention to. In fact, this discussion today, when thinking about Mexico, is exactly happening at the point in which today Mexico surpassed 100,000 COVID-19 related deaths. So, of course, there's a lot to think about it. Let me start first thinking about the diversity of our audience, and I would like to start with a very brief recount of some of the main features of criminal violence in Mexico, in case this can be useful to understand the subsequent discussion. The evolution of organized crime in Mexico is deeply intertwined with its political evolution. As of national units began to experiment party alternation, violence began to rise in the mid-1990s. As a result of a rising competition among criminal groups and a largely ineffective militarized strategy to fight organized crime that began roughly in 2006, among other elements present today, Mexico has experienced levels of violence that are significantly greater than the typical, than what we typically see in civil wars. Two features in particular have stood out when looking at the Mexican case, which is one, the rising number of homicides, and an unprecedented phenomenon of missing persons, which I would like to touch upon a little bit towards the end. These tragic numbers are the result of a long-term criminal wars that have transformed organized crime groups, their objectives, their relationship with the state, and their targets of violence. So what we see today is a major multiplication of criminal groups competing fiercely over territorial controls. And this competition has led to organized crime groups to diversify their activities And what we see, we're not longer thinking only about drugs. This is about extractivist industries, the control of civilian populations, the regulation of economic activity. In this process, it's, as I said, it's no longer about drug trafficking routes. It's about controlling also political administrative jurisdictions, meaning a new interest in local governance. And so taking this into account, I believe that what we have seen in this process before COVID and then now moving into a global health crisis, what the COVID-19 pandemic has done, I believe, is exacerbate previous features of criminal violence, as well as unveil some of its latent features and strategies in the Mexican case, which from what Rebecca has shown, it's not something necessarily particular to Mexico, and I'm sure we're going to be talking about this in the following presentations by Eduardo and Alberto. So this graph shows the trends in the raw numbers of intentional homicides in Mexico between 2015 and 2020. And we can see a stable, a relatively steady rise through the past 5 years. Although Mexico did not experience an obligatory lockdown, economic and social activity did slow down, as in many other parts of the globe. But homicides, if you see the end of this graph, did fluctuate around the average count that we had in the previous year of 2,400 homicides per month. This speaks to how the pandemic has reiterated features of criminal violence, as I had mentioned before. But of course, it is worth noting, just in the similar vein as Rebecca was referring to the Venezuelan case, that there's of course a significant variation geographically across Mexico. I'm not going to go specifically into that geographic dispersion because I think there's a more important discussion on these strategies that we're seeing from organized criminal groups. But I think that this graph is showing precisely how we're not necessarily looking into a slowdown of criminal activity as some could have expected, right? In a lockdown, maybe there's something different in terms of how violence is displayed. Well, this is not the case for what is probably the main statistics that we use to look into criminal violence, just because of its reliability. But perhaps something that has called most media attention is criminal groups' public actions and strategies amid the pandemic, mainly to control civilian population in resonance with the Venezuelan case, as Rebecca was showing. And I think this is what I'm referring to, that it's about how COVID has reiterated some features and has just put forward things that we perhaps were not being able to see as much before, but that were there already. I think although we still need a deep and serious work to document when, where, and how these actions took place, we know that in at least 10 of 32 Mexican states, criminal groups deployed diverse strategies of social control amid the COVID-19 pandemic. Specifically, organized crime groups have engaged in food provision. Some of the main and largest criminal organizations engage in food provision and openly signed, sealed, deliver packages that explicitly show their names and labels. So this is about, it was a very open marketing strategy, having almost like a merchandise, as you can see for the case of the Sinaloa cartel, with the Chapo's face on those boxes. We also have evidence of organized criminal groups' offers to loan money to informal merchants. This strategy appears to have helped groups to establish wider extortion rackets and amplify their recruitment strategies. Also in full resonance with what Rebecca was referring to, and how this is an important moment for organized crime groups to take advantage of unemployment. And rising unemployment, and also organized crime groups enforce lockdowns using much more violent approaches, from threats to armed attacks and kidnappings. So these are strategies that we had seen in the past, but became more evident now amid the COVID-19 lockdown. We had seen this in many other, in several Mexican states. For example, during Christmas, the Zetas would distribute also food and toys for kids. But it is important to note and emphasize that this is not a public goods provision. The distribution of these goods is conditional and is largely intertwined with violent practices, as I can see, I'm referring here, enforced lockdowns, for example, and as Rebecca was saying too, use more violent approaches, from threats, armed attacks, and kidnappings. So the distribution of goods is conditional and is largely intertwined with violent practices. And more importantly, these are neither stable nor long-term strategies. My colleagues here have done extensive work in understanding specifically the display of the social controls. The work by Edgar, Beatriz Magaloni, Alberto Diaz-Cayeros on understanding specifically the logic of when and where organized crime groups are willing to use the social controls, more violent ones or not. But I think that the pandemic pushes us to dig deeper into some past and new pending questions, whose answers may be harder to get, as the pandemic is also changing the way in which we as researchers can conduct our own investigations, and perhaps that's something to discuss further in our Q&A. I think that one initial question is digging deeper into the differential strategies of criminal control during the pandemic. As I said, Beatriz Magaloni's work has been crucial for thinking about revealing the importance that territorial control has for the actual display of violent versus non-violent criminal controls. One wonders, however, if the pandemic affected the logic behind the strategies. Second, we must think about what are the effects that organized crime group social controls have on the spread of the pandemic. One wonders specifically if criminal groups were indeed quote unquote successful in containing the pandemic and their control territories, and therefore, third question, whether these strategies may have short and long-term effects on individual behavior and attitudes in the post-pandemic period. We already know that violence radically transforms the way citizens relate with the state, and COVID-19 may have exacerbated the citizens' political disengagement, particularly if we consider that today the state faces even larger challenges and limitations. And precisely, I'd like to briefly address the role of the Mexican state amid the pandemic. The Mexican state, as in many other countries across the globe, faces a new layer of responsibilities. But there are some features that stand out that could potentially make things more complicated. While there is a natural shift away from security due to the focus on the health crisis, in the past months, there has been a renewed role for the National Guard in Mexico and a continuation of the militarized strategy that we know is inefficient. And in addition, the federal government has eliminated public trust funds that enable the attention of victims of crime, human rights defenders, and journalists at risk, many of which are directly threatened by organized crime. And this puts them at a greater risk and is also likely to delay any possibilities of resolving cases and achieving truth and justice. One of the marking features of how things have evolved in Mexico is that victims themselves are doing their own searches. They are digging literally the ground in search for the loved ones. And today, and to do that, they needed those funds, but also being able to do it meant not having a health crisis in progress. So this has limited a lot of the processes of accountability going through state prosecutors' offices, pushing investigations, and this has put many of those investigations on hold for now. It is important to note that all of this is taking place in an ongoing process of weak horizontal checks in Mexico with weak a weak National Human Rights Commission, configuration in Congress that cannot enable a wider diversity in opinions and the eventual public policy process that would unravel. A wide political polarization that has led to the confrontation of opposition and federal government, specifically in the case of security and how security policies are going to be established and coordination can take place, which we know is crucial for effective strategies to confront crime and to contain violence. And attacks against civil society that also diminish some of these accountability mechanisms that are crucial when we think about how to contain violence, criminal violence that is largely sustained also through protection rackets. I must say, however, that I cannot close this initial intervention without mentioning a key element that marked the beginning stages of the pandemic lockdown in Mexico, and that has been present throughout this month since March. We began the lockdown just a couple of weeks after the symbolic and powerful shutdown of activities by women across Mexico on March 8th, 2020. This resonated deeply as the number of femicides rose significantly, as you can see in this graph. Precisely in February, we were seeing a significant rise in femicides in Mexico. Even by official government figures, we can see that violence against women had been rising and then have reached an additional peak in this past June, with 94 femicides. Other statistics on violence against women, including calls to the 911 line, indicate significant increases too. This is a common trend across the world, even in Europe. But what's different here is that is the state response. Across several states, including Mexico City, women protesting against these acts of violence precisely committed against women have faced severe police repression. And this speaks to the urgent need to professionalize police forces to generate conditions for security for women, both inside and outside their homes. As Abby Cordova's work from the University of Notre Dame has shown, the state incapacity to protect women in combination with territorial control by organized crime groups can just leave women at a greater vulnerable state. So to conclude, the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated longstanding features of criminal violence in Mexico, from new and open social controls to the state's reduced capacity. There are features, trends, consequences that we haven't fully documented yet, to a large extent because collecting data in this under these conditions is limited for us as academics, but for public institutions themselves too. Going back to the reduced capacity and new forms of operation amid health restrictions. INEGI, Mexico's Statistics Institute, has had to move and change its own methodologies for survey collection, for example. Even if Mexico has had only a partial and voluntary lockdown, the fact is that people are not fully mobile, and we still need to see how violence will unravel once restrictions are lifted, and then examine how organized crime, the state and society interact in what would probably be a very different world from what we knew back in February 2020. But given what we have seen in terms of the ability of organized crime to establish territorial controls, to show its full power in many of municipalities across Mexico, we must be paying special attention to the upcoming 2021 midterm election in Mexico. It's the largest election that will take place, with many concurrent elections in every single state. At the local level, which is the level at which organized crime is clearly operating, and potentially we're potentially facing one of the most violent electoral processes in Mexican history. And what we have seen amid the COVID pandemic on the power of organized crime to exert those political and social controls should be turning on some red lights and start working on what we could be seeing moving forward for next year. So again, thank you all for the attention, and I look forward to the comments, questions, and reactions.
Thank you so much, Sandra. This is great. It's always great to hear your thoughts on these issues. I'm also looking forward to hear more in the Q&A. Just to all our participants who have sent their questions, I'm taking note on all of them, and I'll try to go through as many as I can at the end. For now, our next speaker is Eduardo Moncada, who is an assistant professor of political science at Barnard College in Columbia University. His research agenda focuses on the political economy of crime and violence, as well as comparative urban politics in Latin America. He's the author of Cities, Business, and the Politics of Urban Violence in Latin America from Stanford University Press, and also the co-editor of Inside Countries, Subnational Research in Comparative Politics. In his forthcoming book, Resisting Extortion, Victims, Criminals, and Police in Latin America, he analyzes the different ways in which victims mobilize to negotiate and or prevent extortion at the hands of armed criminal groups. He has published articles in Perspectives of Politics, Latin American Research Review, Comparative Politics, among others. With that, Eduardo, we look forward to hear from you.
Great, thank you. Let me get my presentation up here for everybody. And I think you should be seeing my slides at this point. So thank you so much. Oh, hold on. I think you have the wrong. There we go. Thank you so much, Edgar, for the invitation, and also Elena Rodriguez for organizing the logistics today. And of course, thank you to Rebecca, to Sandra, and to Alberto. It's a real treat and honor to be able to share this space with the three of you and with Edgar, all of you scholars whose work I admire and have learned from so much. My challenge is now to try and say something insightful after two very insightful presentations and before what I'm sure will be another insightful presentation. So let's see what I can do here. And I think it's worth starting off and kind of underscoring a point that both Sandra and Rebecca have noted, which is just like the pandemic has had sort of uneven consequences across and within countries for issues of state capacity, public health outcomes, economic development. It also has had uneven effects on dynamics of crime and public security throughout the world. And that's particularly evident in the Western Hemisphere, where news headlines like the one that you see on the screen kind of point to the different types of crime that are increasing, decreasing, changing, morphing as a result of the pandemic. And what that does, I think, is highlight on the one hand the need to disaggregate crime and forms of security and insecurity, which I think both the preceding presentations highlight in a very powerful way, and to unpack those dynamics across space within countries as well, zooming down, as Sandra mentioned, down to the local level where organized crime operates and sort of establishes its territorial control, and where we can kind of best observe some of these dynamics. And so I'd like to focus my comments on one particular type of crime, which is extortion. As Edgar had mentioned, this is the focus of my current book project that I've been working on for the last several years, in which I study how victims experience and mobilize in response to extortion at the hands of armed criminal groups in Latin America, specifically in parts of Colombia, El Salvador, and Mexico. And what's particularly interesting, I think, is that this is a widespread yet relatively understudied aspect of the criminal landscape in Latin America. So with the exception of a handful of studies, including a wonderful paper published in Comparative Political Studies by Alberto and his co-authors on extortion in Mexico, we don't know as much about extortion and its dynamics as we do some of the dynamics of lethal violence. But even before the pandemic, it was becoming clear that most people in the region experienced organized crime, not always through spectacular acts of violence, but instead through this kind of everyday victimization in which they were trapped in these extortive relations with criminal actors that demand money under threat and use of physical force against them, and sometimes against family members as well. And this pervasiveness of extortion, I think, makes it particularly interesting to start thinking about some of the questions on how the pandemic has affected this particularly very complex form of crime. And one place where we can observe some sort of intriguing changes in the dynamics of extortion is in El Salvador. So unlike several of its Central American counterparts, the government of El Salvador adopted a very strict lockdown measures early on in the pandemic. And this likely contributed to the country's relatively low levels of infection and COVID-related deaths, with about 37,000 confirmed cases of infection to date and a little over 1,000 confirmed COVID-related deaths. The country adopted a major lockdown across its territory starting in March of 2020. And this was very contentious and generated sort of contentious politics between the executive, President Bukele, and the legislature. But it was extended several times until late August. It was actually only in September that the country lifted or relaxed some of these lockdown measures. Now, I've been doing work here on dynamics of extortion, and while I haven't been able to go back to study how the pandemic has affected this type of crime, I have managed to actively keep in touch with key contacts in the field with whom I've discussed what's been happening on the ground. And so these are a combination of individuals that are victims of extortion currently, and others that have been studying these issues in various ways in El Salvador for some time now, both from within and outside of government and academia. And so what do they point to in terms of what's changed and what's sort of stayed the same under COVID? First, it's important to note that extortion is crucial to the revenue base of gangs in El Salvador, right? Also called maras, to the point that gangs have become synonymous with being forced to pay the extortion fees, also called la renta, or the rent. But more broadly, gangs use extortion as part of the foundation for territorial control. Much like states, gangs and other criminal actors use the mechanics of extortion to make populations and activities in their territories legible. The face-to-face interactions with community members and leaders that are taxed, the patrolling of businesses and households to assess how much the gang is going to tax, all of that generates information that criminal actors use to establish a base of knowledge about who lives in their territory, who works where, who makes how much money, and in turn, who the gang taxes and how much they tax. So whether and how COVID-19 impacts extortion by gangs has some important implications for the strength of gangs and for life in territories where these gangs govern, particularly in a context where there's a general consensus that gangs in the country number about 60,000 and have an extended social network of about 500,000 people. These are family members and relatives of gang members. And a general consensus that gangs are responsible for a substantial share of the violence that El Salvador has experienced since the end of the country's civil war in the 1990s. So what do we see so far? And again, this is preliminary because, like many faculty members, I'm unable to travel to the field right now given travel restrictions, and more broadly also, a whole host of sort of interesting and important ethical challenges of conducting research abroad in the middle of a pandemic. But based on what I found having studied extortion in the country prior to the pandemic, and based what sources on the ground are telling me now, there are sort of 3 points that I want to highlight in the time that I have. The first is that the pandemic is generating strains on the gangs and their organizational structure and capacity, particularly at the micro level where extortion takes place. So here, during the early phase of the pandemic, El Salvador again adopted this fairly stringent policy measure in response to COVID, including shelter-in-place orders that made it very difficult for business firms, particularly micro, small, and medium-sized firms, to stay open and afloat. Now, these are precisely the key targets of extortion in the country. The majority of firms that pay the rent to gangs are precisely those firms who, by virtue of their size, are classified as micro, small, or medium, both in the formal and informal sectors. So gangs early on in the pandemic found that the stringency of state policy, right, to prevent the spread of the virus translated into reduced revenue because the targets of extortion simply didn't have money to pay. In some cases, leaders of the cliques, the local level cells of gangs, then don't have money or resources to be able to pay and provide money to their foot soldiers or send money up the bureaucratic ladder to gang leaders, most of which are in prisons today. Now, this is particularly challenging for gangs in El Salvador because they, unlike some of the other criminal actors in parts of Mexico and other parts of Central America, gangs in El Salvador are not as deeply ingrained in that commodity chain of illicit drugs, right? So they don't have that as a revenue stream or a major revenue stream. So with extortion as really a sort of a central part of the gang's ability to survive, this raises some interesting questions about whether the pandemic has weakened the gangs in terms of their organizational capacity, right? In terms of their ability to maintain members as well as for their leaders to be well-resourced, both of which have sort of been hallmarks of the gangs since the 1990s, when the country adopted hardline stances against the gangs, and the gangs organized into these hierarchical, almost bureaucratic structures that organize themselves territorially, but also internally from the prisons out on down to the municipal level and the neighborhood level as well. So the pandemic is generating some strains on the resources that have been able to sustain that sort of structure for the gangs. But as I noted before, extortion is about much more than the forced transfer of money from one hand to another. It's also about power between actors. So criminal actors like gangs, but also others that carry out extortion, use these relations to force their victims to succumb to their rule in the territories that they control. And they do so by using a variety of social and political strategies to dominate their victims, to make their victims perceive that there is no other authority other than criminal authority in these spaces. And in some instances, gangs in El Salvador have used the pandemic and the inability of people to pay to try and reaffirm this role as informal rulers. So how do they do so? They do so by telling their victims that for now, the gangs are not going to charge them their tax. And in some instances, the gangs will inform victims that the rent is forgiven during this period of time until people get back to work. Or in other instances, they make clear that the missed sort of payments will need to be made up at some point once people get back to work, right? So in another case, the broader implication here is a sort of reaffirmation of the informal power that gangs have in these settings. Their ability, even in the middle of a pandemic, to tell people that they should either be saving up their money to pay the gang leaders later, or to take some comfort in the gang's benevolence, right? Both practices serve the same broader purpose of underscoring how incredibly powerful these criminal actors are and the large amount of informal authority that they wield. Third point, and this is more of a sort of tentative hypothesis. So the first point I made was about how the pandemic has affected the gangs at an organizational level. The second was about how it affects relations between gangs and their victims. The third point is about how the pandemic affects relations between gangs and the state. And here I want to make 2 points. The first is one that I think has implications beyond El Salvador, which is that as part of the response to the pandemic in Latin America, we've seen the growing involvement of the state security institutions in enforcing some of these public health measures. And this raises questions about civil-military relations, particularly given what scholars like Gustavo Flores Macias at Cornell or Cristina Mani at Oberlin College have already identified as the growing militarization of policy challenges in the region over the last few years, where civilian governments are increasingly turning to the military to help solve critical policy challenges, from the drug trade to now aspects of the pandemic. By positioning the military and the police at the front lines of efforts to enforce public health measures, we risk seeing a deepening of their political power. And worrisome here is that neither institution, the police or the military in Latin America, has a particularly good track record of being held accountable for their behaviors and practices, particularly violations against human rights. In the case of El Salvador, the last few years have seen a growing number of cases of individual police and military personnel involved in extrajudicial violence against alleged gang members. Part of my research for my current book focuses, for example, on instances where handfuls of victims of extortion and individual police work together to engage in extrajudicial violence against gang members, assassinating, torture, disappearing them. And President Nayib Bukele has not hesitated to use both the police and military institutions in enforcing some of these lockdown measures, which could further create the political space for police and military to amplify their targeting of gangs for extrajudicial violence. It's important to note here as well, who counts as a gang member is itself a contested and contentious question. So as I noted, gangs in El Salvador count on family and relatives that number at least 500,000 people. And these individuals often participate in aspects of gang violence and gang crime. This is particularly relevant for extortion, where family members are often put in charge of collecting the extortion fees so that the gang members aren't exposed to the police, or laundering the extortion fees on behalf of gang members, which has led people who for all intents and purposes are not gang members to be targeted by rival gangs, but also by state security institutions. And a second point here about relations between the gang and the state during the era of COVID has to do with sort of the political economy of extortion and who's a victim. So in El Salvador, as I noted before, small, micro, medium-sized businesses have historically been the primary targets of extortion. This doesn't mean that large firms or even multinationals have not been the targets of extortion, but perhaps not with the same modalities or the systematic focus by the gangs. But El Salvador, as in other parts of Latin America, is experiencing and will continue to experience a very significant economic downturn due to the pandemic. And gangs, and perhaps other criminal actors that rely on extortion, may be forced to reconfigure the political economy of extortion to focus on large and multinational firms that are able to survive this economic storm. It's one thing to extort the local bus drivers or the owners of the pupuserias. It's another to extort Coca-Cola or Pepsi or Walmart. And if gangs begin to expand the scope of their victims to include these larger actors, this could have important political consequences. So unlike bus drivers or owners of small restaurants or informal vendors, large firms, multinationals, have more ties to the state and more political power. And this may mean that this new crop of victims may encourage the state to pursue those hardline responses against gangs, which historically has been shown to lead to extrajudicial violence by the state as part of highly violent periods of state and criminal conflict. So thank you very much for your time today, and I look forward to the Q&A and to the discussion with everyone else as well.
Thank you so much, Eduardo. I think that this research and also the research that Sandra shows on crimes against women and the research on Rebecca's research on communities is crucial to understand that this violence actually has effects in the lives of people. So these are not just numbers, it's not just data, but this is really people who is being affected. And I think this is all this framework that you all have, I think is telling us that. And I think I really appreciate that. Our fourth speaker is Alberto Diaz-Cayeros, who I thank to because he joined kind of the, on the last minute. So he's a senior fellow at the Center on Democracy, Development and the Rule of Law, and director of the Center for Latin American Studies at Stanford University. His research interests include federalism, poverty relief, indigenous governance, political economy of health, violence and citizen security in Mexico and Latin America. He's the author of Federalism, Fiscal Authority and Centralization in Latin America from Cambridge University Press, and also the co-author with Federico Esteves and Beatriz Magaloni on the political logic of poverty relief, as well as numerous journal articles and book chapters. He's also currently working on a project on the developmental legacies of colonial rule and governance in indigenous communities in Mexico, and is the co-PI with Beatriz Magaloni of the project Citizen Trust and Evidence-Based Policy Accountability and Professionalization in Mexico. And also I should add, I'm really happy to have him here because he was one of my advisors during my PhD, so I'm really happy to welcome him in his event. With that, Alberto, you have the floor.
Thank you, Edgar. Thank you for the generous introduction, and thank you all for this very nuanced and very deep presentations that precede me. I think if you really think about the way Edgar put up a program, we have already heard about criminal governance in Venezuela. We have heard about aspects having to do with the political protection, but also very explicit putting the finger at the question of feminicides and these whole dimensions of extortion. I think these are precisely the types of issues that we will have to be understanding better in the coming months and years. And I'm very happy that I'm here in this good company. And thank you, Alana, also for the invitation. I will devote my presentation more to some issues related to COVID. So hopefully that will also complement. I'm sorry if I'm sharing my screen on the wrong page. So that will hopefully give you a sense of how some of these things that we've been discussing in the first three presentations fit within a larger picture. And I will make specific comments about the epidemic on a particularly vulnerable group, which is indigenous peoples in Mexico. Well, let me take it from here. So throughout Latin America, one of the things we don't need to share necessarily these slides, because I think most people are familiar with these trends. They've seen, this comes from our world in data, and in particular, I want to highlight that Esteban Ortiz Ospina has been very, very careful in trying to make sure that the quality of the Latin American data on this international effort kind of is more or less trustworthy. So people see these kinds of images and they say, okay, well, the basic point is the epidemic is not contained. These are new confirmed cases per million people in the various countries in the region. As this is standardized per capita, you get like a little bit of a different ranking than what you usually get. But the thing I want to highlight here is, regardless of which way you think of it, you always will get, for example, Uruguay and Cuba in lower positions, lower ranked positions. You will get a country like Brazil in higher ranked positions. But obviously this is one of the most important things that I'm going to highlight, this is not necessarily a very good way to think about the problem of the pandemic, because any metric of confirmed cases is likely to be produced by the way we generate the data on the cases. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is about some of the ways in which we produce data that we then analyze on things like violence, as well as on things like COVID. This is a more trustworthy way to see the impact of the epidemic in the region. And here what we have is the cumulative confirmed deaths, in some ways similar to the kind of literature that we have on homicides. You can have a very large cifra negra, unreported crime in any country in Latin America, but usually homicides are a little bit more reliable as data, because it is, as some scholars have argued, it is harder to hide the bodies, it is more difficult. But of course, if you think about the fosas and the disappear that Sandra mentioned in the case of Mexico and many other countries, you can also hide bodies, you can also disappear people. But in this case, the deaths from COVID do give us a little bit of a better ranking. This is a logarithmic scale. Again, people are quite familiar with this kind of data, but what I want to highlight here is, do notice, for example, El Salvador, something that Eduardo pointed out, the lockdown measures there seem to have kept the epidemic, you see it with its peer here, there is Costa Rica. The Venezuelan data, I'm always suspicious about what the real data should look like. So take it always with a grain of salt. But I do believe, for example, there's no question that the Cuba or the Uruguay data tell us these are the countries that did the best effort at containment. And then there is always a bit of a challenge, I think, as political scientists, to think about what happened in places like Argentina or Chile or Colombia, where the containment measures were the distancing strategies were very stringent, and still they did not do very well. And then, of course, we hear the stories about Ecuador, but Ecuador actually was able, after this very, very massive crisis at the beginning, to improve things. And now, there is another metric. This is not exactly the correct one either, but I think cumulative deaths tells us a lot, which is this metric of the CFR, of the case fatality rate. And what we try to do in this metric of the case fatality rate is to know something about what percentage of the tested population, so that's why it's a case fatality rate, what percentage of the tested population is dying. You can see that the highest case fatality rate probably in the world still right now is Mexico. That's to some extent because of how little testing is done in Mexico. And those case fatality rates do come down, from very large levels as most countries have improved their capacity to do epidemiological surveillance and more testing. Mexico is a problem because it suggests either that the disease would be much more deadly than anywhere else, which is unlikely, or that because of the testing strategy that Mexico has taken, in fact, there's so much more going on in terms of the circulation of the disease than whatever figures we get from the country. What I'm going to show you next is the same estimations of case fatality rates, but now they are done in the context of a logit model. This is a statistical model. I've been updating this kind of data analysis in my GitHub. I have not updated this one because this is the latest data that was released November 15. But what you see here is basically the probability of dying from either as male and female. That's what you have on the left side. So you have male and female graphs by age. These are things that people are quite familiar with, but you can see that in this case, this is an average, it's an unconditioned estimation, but you can see that regardless of whether you get a positive test for COVID or a negative test for COVID in Mexico, you're having this very high case fatality rate in the 0.1, which is like a 10%, like the figure you saw before. And you also see this one on the right is a little bit of a more nuanced conditioning. What we're seeing here is a seriously ill patient. So a patient it's a male patient with pneumonia, diagnosed with pneumonia when he comes into the health system, intubated at the intensive care unit in the hospital. So this is kind of the worst case scenario of how sick someone can be with the data that we have available. And the graph here shows you a little bit the differences, the variance across states, across Mexican states in the case fatality ratio. But still, what you notice there is the case fatality ratio of this kind of patient is huge. You're talking about 40% to 60%, depending on whether they test negative or positive to COVID. And of course, part of what I'm trying to show you here is that whenever in Mexico we have a negative COVID test, it is possible that this is a false negative, that a lot of the cases that are circulating might actually be going undetected. That same kind of evidence can be seen from other aspects of the analysis. So I'm not going to stop on this one because it becomes a bit more about epidemiology and more complicated, but even the comorbidities can be estimated. That's what you have on the left side by different pre-existing conditions, or in this case, is the case fatality ratio for, again, a man with pneumonia who is intubated in an intensive care unit in a hospital. Those comorbidities and those case fatality ratios seem to batter on what kind of hospital you are being attended by. So people have observed this. The private hospitals take it a little bit with a grain of salt because private hospitals in general are not getting the worst COVID cases, but there is a very sharp increase in the probability of dying if you are being attended in an EAMS hospital, which is the general hospitals that most of the insured population go to. Again, it is a complicated inference because EAMS hospitals are also getting some of the sickest patients. But for example, when you see the comorbidities in the EAMS hospitals, that's kind of the upper left graph on the left graph. The comorbidities, for example, of EAMS hospital from renal chronic illnesses are much, much higher. The odds ratios there are 2.4, much higher. And it is unlikely that it has something to do with the population of patients that go into EAMS. There is also something going on in the governance of health institutions in Mexico. This final thing is, of course, what is going on because of so little testing in Mexico is that what is usually referred to as the positivity rate, that is what percentage of the tests that are performed come out as COVID cases. It's extremely high. It is probably the highest in the world. I'm sorry, we don't have keys on this map, but the red colors are more than 60% positivity rates. That's each test that is being made, 60% are positive. Then you get the orange areas are from 40 to 60. From 20 to 60, and the green areas are less than 20% positivity rate. Take this data again with a grain of salt. The whole green area of Chiapas, to me, what it suggests is that whatever the government of Chiapas is doing in terms of testing is completely different from what is going on in the rest of the country. Even take with a grain of salt what the government used to call the municipios de esperanza. These are the green municipalities you see in Oaxaca, green specks of green, green specks in the middle of Oaxaca, in the middle of a lot of red. Most likely what is going on in those municipalities is that the testing is very different from the rest of the country. What is really suggesting this map is this generalized circulation of the disease far and above anything that is being detected by the surveillance system. Now, this will get a little bit more complicated, but let me tell you what this does. What I'm doing here is I'm separating all the municipalities you just saw before, and they're being put into bins by development level. So even though we do not know from this data set that the government has released with 2.5 million tests, in that data set, we do know exactly where the residence is of each of the persons who has been tested. And we can rank order municipalities in bins of 10% of deciles of the population of the country, ordering the poorest municipalities on the left and the richest municipalities on the country in the right. So that's what this graph does. It basically puts, if you think about it the way I'm setting it up, the first bin has a lot of very small, very poor municipalities. The last bin on the right, the 10th decile, has just a few cities, mostly the metropolitan area of Mexico City, some of the municipalities of Nuevo León. It's just about 30 municipalities or delegaciones, alcaldías, I'm sorry, that are in that 10th bin, but it's 10% of the population. So if mortality were the same, these are both positive COVID tests and negative COVID tests. If mortality were the same across all the income or development levels in Mexico, you would have like a pretty much 16,000 deaths in each of the bins. Clearly, you have much less deaths in the poorest places, but the problem might be that what we are actually observing is the misreporting of a lot of the deaths of what people have referred to as the excess mortality. We do not really know what we really would like to know, which is the infection fatality rate. This is again, these are the deaths that I presented before, standardized by the ones where we actually are doing testing. But in the study of excess mortality that the government has done, and here I'm not using real data for this, this is me allocating into the municipalities what I think is probably the way the other 100,000 deaths, Sandra mentioned that there's already 100,000 deaths in Mexico. Well, there is another 100,000 deaths that the government has estimated that are the excess deaths as registered in the Registro Civil. And those deaths in death certificates are very likely to be in the small, poor municipalities that are on the left of this graph. Now, I switch quickly to violence, and the simple thing I want to tell you about violence is that criminal violence in Mexico has continued basically unabated. This is the map, the most current map from Diego Valle, and you can see, there's still this huge, the size of the circle tells you about the number of deaths, and the color about the murder rate. This is similar to what Sandra showed you before. A little bit different in the way I'm using a metric. I'm looking at both homicidios dolosos and homicidios culposos. Homicidios culposos can be things like manslaughter in a traffic accident. The reason I'm doing that is because for the last few months, or more than a few months, the last year or so, in Beatriz Magaloni's lab, we have been observing that there is probably some spikes in various places in the country where homicides are being hidden from the carpetas de investigación as homicidios culposos instead of dolosos. So we started actually using all the data together. With the pandemic and the reduction of mobility, what you would expect is that there should be a slowdown in sort of the movement of people across highways, etc. Those kinds of homicidios should decrease. That's what, the reason why you have that kind of decline in the curve. But the bottom line is what you have is this huge, huge level of mortality, of death. This is about twice the scale here is about twice the graph that Sandra had shown you before, because it includes also these culposo homicides. Another thing about the carpeta de investigación that we've noticed, I should point out, is when people find fosas, when the families and the mothers and the brave brave people that are doing these searches for the missing persons, those usually get miscounted because they're counted only by the case and not necessarily by the number of bodies or the number of people that have been found. But be as it may, the point is there is nothing suggesting that the violence has been reduced because of the COVID epidemic. To some extent, the COVID epidemic hit precisely when one of the cartels has become more ascendant, the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación. You can notice that in this other graph, what it does is it looks just the same way as we do excess mortality for things like COVID. This looks at excess homicides in Mexican states, comparing the deaths of April or the deaths of May or the death of June compared to the deaths of the previous 5 years. So the typical pattern of mortality, according to homicidios dolosos and culposos, how much deviation there is. And you can see that there's things going on in places like Quintana Roo and Yucatan that have always been relatively peaceful. And there is some recomposition of violence into Chihuahua, Baja California, and the places that we already know have been at war with the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, like Jalisco or Michoacán, are there in the places of excess mortality. And some places have improved a bit, but generally the question is that in general, violence has continued in Mexico. Let me finally spend 2 more minutes sharing with you some of the ongoing work I'm doing on indigenous peoples. This is a particularly vulnerable population on several fronts. And the simple thing I want to show you is that analyzing, again, this is, as I mentioned, more than 2 million data points. This is the case fatality rate for indigenous people. If you speak an indigenous language, according to the data we have available right now, with the caveat that there's probably little testing on the indigenous areas of the country, the poorest places where a lot of the cases might be going on undetected, but you have twice the probability of dying in those cases where someone speaks, for example, an indigenous language. There's also this self-adscription variable in the data set. This can also be seen, these are week by week, and you can see that the general population is the curve on the left. That's always smoother. And every week, you see that indigenous peoples have much higher case fatality ratios, most of them above 10%. The same kind of graph I showed you before, where you have by development deciles, 10%, 10%, 10% of the population in the municipalities allocated to each of the deciles, you can see that the case fatality rate of people who speak indigenous languages is much higher than the case fatality rate for the rest of the population, which in this data is around 6%. This is conditional on development levels. And we can do that same descriptive analysis. This comes from OLS and probability estimates, which basically give us the same picture. There is a possibility that we're missing much more death going on the left of these graphs. But be as it may, it is clear that there is much more mortality. At the same time, the indigenous regions seem to be the ones that have been able to create some forms of social distancing norms, new forms of creating trust in the community, enforcement of cordon sanitaire that hinder transmission in the same way that they have done this to hinder the incursions of criminal violence and extortion. I think we really need to understand a bit better how there is this interaction between the public health infrastructure, the kind of policing, either both self-policing or policing by the forces of the state, and what kind of accountability is being generated in these indigenous underserved communities. I am particularly interested. I think we have opportunities to understand a lot of questions about the credibility of public messaging and this interaction between federal, state, and municipal and community assembly levels. But I do want to say, just in closing, that I don't think we have, acknowledged how much we really don't know of what's going on in what the government has called, the Mexican government has called these municipios de la esperanza, which are really places where the state capacity failures in registration and health access has not allowed us to really appreciate the true dimensions of the pandemic. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alberto. So we have a couple of very good questions here. I hope if maybe we can, I would like to have time to ask some of them, and hopefully our speakers can stay a little bit longer than we expected. So probably 10 minutes after 1:30, if that's okay. I'll try to summarize as much as I can, but I really wanted to give opportunity to our participants to ask some of their questions. So the first one it's actually two questions for Rebecca, but I want to combine them because I think the second part is it's also, I would like to hear the perspective of all the other speakers on this one. So Grace, she's an undergrad student at the University of Michigan. Her question is really how this militarized aspect that you show in Venezuela is affecting the testing and the distribution of healthcare. So is this basically the fact that we are these communities have more militarization, it's also having some issues with the healthcare itself. And the second part of the question, which I would like to open to all of you, it comes from actually the director of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, Victoria Langland. And the question is really, so focus on Venezuela, why groups were smaller in the first place. And I would like to rephrase this on how this crisis is gonna change the composition of these groups. So because I can imagine that some of these groups can increase their power, become more stronger, but also some other smaller groups will start to show up and see these opportunities to seize the moment, and we'll have also some more fragmentation. So we have these two forces at the same time, like stronger groups that already existed and also new smaller groups. So I would like to hear what you think about this.
Yeah, great. Thank you for such wonderful questions. So what I'll try and do is just answer this first question from Grace and then speak really briefly about gangs in Caracas so I can turn it over to the other speakers. In terms of the militarization of police raids in COVID or access to healthcare, I mean, it was interesting listening to the other presenters, because as far as I'm aware, there's not really much that's being done by police or the National Guard, for example, to engage in testing. They have been rounding people up who have tested positive and kind of put them in hotels and have them make them stay there until they test negative for COVID. But while they've been an important part of the lockdown, obviously, the police and National Guard really have not been involved in testing per se. And then to the other question, I'm going to try and get to these as quickly as possible since we have a lot. So we don't have any evidence that the gangs that I was talking about, like Ronnie's gang, has been doing any kind of testing or really has anything to do with providing healthcare services in the same way that Sandra was talking about in her presentation. And we see that his gang is very involved in providing loans or helping with access to water or to gas. But if you think about, the provision of healthcare, that's something that's a little bit more specialized. So we don't really see a gang's involvement in that. And then I'll close that question off just by noting that Venezuela, as Alberto mentioned, it's an incredibly difficult place to know anything about, particularly in terms of official statistics. And it's very difficult to know how many actually kits they had early on, but we know they had very few in comparison to a lot of other countries in Latin America. So just being able to access these on the part of the state, and then on the part of gangs that have relationships with the state, which is incredibly limited, and even still is for a number of different reasons, one of which is US sanctions on Venezuela, which shouldn't be making it difficult technically to actually import medical supplies, but it still is. And then just really quickly on I really appreciate this question on why gangs have historically been so small in Caracas, largely because I would love to kind of know the answer to that question. It's something that I thought about a lot when I was engaging in my dissertation research, which was between 2012 and 2014. But I imagine it has something to do with the fact that Venezuela only in the past 20 years or so has become a major exporter of drugs, and that only happens in very specific places. But in a place like Caracas, the gangs in general tend to depend on micro trafficking. I mean, I think the types of activities they're engaging in don't really require a lot of articulation or coordination, most likely. And then I think when, similar to other cases that we see in Latin America, these gangs also just kind of come up in certain communities or places, right? And kind of tend to stick to those places and communities unless there's an impetus for coordination, which is what I'm arguing is happened with the OLP. So it's really just kind of thinking about what were the incentives to push towards coordination that I think just didn't exist previously. So now I'll turn it over to other people because I would love to hear their answers to these questions also.
Does someone else has an insight?
Well, I was hoping Sandra would give us some insight on this, but I will say a couple of things of what we have observed, at least in Mexico. And Sandra might be able to correct me because she has a bit of a greater sense, I think, of what's going on in the ground in some regions. But in the work we have done in Michoacán, which has been field work that got kind of interrupted by the pandemic, right now we are actually doing, in lieu of interviews to people, we're doing interviews in businesses through telephone. So that's the way we have replaced this, impossibility to do research in person. But in Michoacán, what I would say is that there is this very complex process going on that has to do with the way the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación has become such a powerful organization, taking over territories, expanding out of Jalisco into Colima, attempting to murder the police chief of Mexico City. So this organization is clearly emboldened in the last year or 2 years. And the organizations in Michoacán, the way we have to think of this is this fragmentation or this unification of criminal organizations seems to be endogenous to the kinds of challenges that they face. So from the I wouldn't call it success, but anyway, from the strategy of the federal government that is articulated a lot of the autodefensas that existed in Michoacán, this incredible fragmentation of protection into very different units, some of them very precarious, some of them linked to the state. For example, Stancítaro created a police that was paid by the limoneros, but was also the official municipal police, while Cherán has a completely different model of security provision. You have this whole diversity of things, but then you face this incredibly powerful disciplined organization that is trying to take over these territories. I think that is completely reconfiguring the way, in Michoacán at least, the way the drug organizations themselves organize as conglomerates or as alliances. That is the comment I would have about this.
Yeah, perhaps I would just add to that second question on reconfigurations of criminal organizations is that I think that in this process that I think we're all discussing on opportunities for recruitment, right? And that as we know, and Alberto was referring to the Mexican case, how there has been a dissemination of local groups that are at the same time are being coordinated by larger cartels, right? The key point here is the extent to which these cartels are going to be able to discipline those local groups and the extent to which this local recruitment is serving, right, the larger purposes for the organization. I think we're probably going to be we're going to see a lot more dissemination and sort of the disaggregation of these organizations. And the key point here is to see those structures that Alberto is referring, whether we have Jalisco Nueva Generación with this strong discipline, but it might contrast deeply with La Unión de Tepito in Mexico City, right, where you have a lot more other local gangs and the extent to which you can have a lot more control to actually induce that discipline and have those gangs actually operate in favor, right, of the according to the cartel. I would expect in terms of the question that Edgar was posing and that Victoria was sharing with us is this dissemination of the smaller groups and which is something that it was a trend that we were already seeing. The key here is to be pointing to something that probably in political science we should be looking more closely into how the different structures of organized crime play out and the extent to which discipline is being able to be is exerted or not.
If I could just add to that, another point that I think would be useful for folks for us as a discipline as well to kind of think through is variation in the ways in which different criminal actors are susceptible to or vulnerable to the pandemic, right? And its kind of fallout. We can imagine sort of small gangs like the ones I was talking to that are resource dependent on extortion and that state policies are attacking exactly that, having a very difficult time, versus some of the larger cartels that Alberto and Sandra are talking about, not necessarily needing to base their entire operation on that type of a resource inflow, but being able to diversify their portfolios, right? And kind of weather the storm of the pandemic and make it through to the other side. So it's almost like a sort of Darwinian, winnowing of the field to some degree is one hypothesis, that the pandemic will sort of leave the strongest on the ground in the landscape, in addition to some of the fragmentation that's being highlighted too.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to say something really briefly about that issue, which I think is interesting if you think in the case of Venezuela, because given the economic crisis that really took off in 2014, I mean, we already saw gangs really engaging in diversification. And so it's kind of interesting to think about, are gangs in Venezuela already better positioned to survive the pandemic because they have been responding to an incredible economic crisis in the or at least over the past few years. So I think that's a really interesting point.
Thank you. So next question is from Martin Macias. He's a PhD student in the University of Michigan, political science. He has a question on how this provision of public goods that, for example, Sandra showed, the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación and some others, can really affect the perception of people, or the acceptance of the general population toward these groups. Is this gonna, in which circumstances we expect to have more support or perhaps more fear from the population, given that they see more often, these groups doing this more often?
Yeah, I think that we have, that is exactly an open question still. We know from the work that Beatriz, Alberto, you, Edgar, that you have also been exploring other cases, that we still have, we know on the one hand that the relationship that civilians have with organized crime groups when engaging in these strategies is not necessarily one. Even if there's good provision, it's not absent of fear, right? And threat is always there as an alternative, and it's always viable. So it is hard to say that then there's an acceptance of organized crime and it's best to have organized crime. Well, in some conditions, of course, there are things that may be facilitated, but let's not forget that, as Eduardo's work has shown, that these victimization experiences are ongoing, are permanent, and are being lived in every single aspect of their lives as they interact. So fear, I would say, it's always present in some way, and Eduardo's work, I think, recent work has touched upon this deeply. And at the same time, the way in which the relationship with state is transforming, however, I think that we have very solid evidence on how this is moving citizens farther away from the state, either because of these controls that organized crime is being able to exert, but also because of a growing distrust and disenchantment, right, with democracy, with political institutions. And so the worrisome thing here is how this just keeps weakening citizen linkages and the possibility of accountability, and making it harder, right, for changes to take place and to raise the cost for politicians to actually make changes in for these different dimensions.
Can I add something, Edgar?
Sure.
So it seems to me that one of the things we don't know a lot about, and this is an opportunity to learn more, is about how to anchor the questions of trust that we usually ask about security forces with questions about other interventions by the state. So we generally think, when you put the police forces in Mexico in BP surveys, we can know people don't trust the local police. They trust a little bit more the state police, and they trust a bit more the federal police, but the one they only trust is really the Marines and the military, the army. But we never kind of ask that together with health providers. So we never kind of really try to think, we just assume a way, I think, that people trust their teachers and people trust their health system. And then they distrust their politicians, their judges, and what we've been finding in the survey that we have now on the field right now, we're still on very preliminary stages, and this is a very peculiar sample because it is of small business owners. I mean, these are telephone numbers in the DNUE, which is the sample frame of the census of establishments. But what we find is that the people are telling us that they trust the health clinic more or less the same as the Guardia Nacional. And they're answering actually that the first point of entry to the health system they would like is a private doctor. So they don't trust the health system as much as we think. And I think that's the kind of things, for example, where the COVID has made it so apparent how different, for example, the health system of Mexico is from SUS in Brazil. The health system in Brazil is a completely remarkably different system with a universal coverage of a very different nature than the Mexican fragmented system.
Thank you. Thanks so much. So perhaps we have time for one more question, which is specifically for Alberto, or also I would like to generalize it to have some final thoughts from all of you. So this question comes from Maria del Carmen Paniagua, and she asked if the map that you show from Chiapas, where we see, I assume this red, or more the greener areas, is because the Zapatista or influence control. And what I will add here is, I think we are seeing also a very important role from communities to contain both the pandemic and the crime. So we see this in indigenous communities in Mexico, but also many other things that are happening, for example, in Brazil, in the favelas. So I would like just to hear if you have some final thoughts on what governments or civil society themselves can do to strengthen communities to contain these two challenges that are going to be scarring communities for a long time.
So if I can just, the punctual thing about Chiapas, I wish it were the Zapatistas communities deep in my heart, but the truth is, it is the failure, I think, of testing of Chiapas that you're really seeing there, just because of the way the borders are completely the borders of the state. So you can see that that's completely, the Caracoles are a very specific area within Chiapas. But part of the problem, I think, as researchers we have right now is we have like a confound of the things Edgar was mentioning, places that have really created cordon sanitaire measures, have really closed the towns, etc., and places we just don't know anything about what's going on in them. And I think we have, like, at least in Mexico, the impression I get is we have this mix of places where, the stories I hear coming out of some villages and communities in Guatemala I think are the same things happening in Mexico just because of lack of access to health facilities. But then there's other places that actually do not have cases because of the way they have used forms of social control. Maybe not dissimilar, it's troubling for me to say this, from the kinds of things Eduardo or Sandra were describing about the criminal organizations enforcing curfews and things like that.
I could add on to that. I think, the question, Edgar, that you're posing about sort of how communities can deal with these issues is kind of a double threat of crime and the pandemic. It makes me think that, and this is probably not a politically viable proposal, right? But there's fascinating research that shows that when governments interact with criminal actors, not big drug cartels, but we're talking about small street gangs that control territory, but that are very influential in these spaces. When they interact with them and coordinate with them, A, they can deal with things like pandemics because they have these authorities on their side, but then B, they can also use those points of leverage to then move forward with more comprehensive approaches to issues of crime and violence in these areas, right? Now that obviously, which politician wants to stand up and say we should be negotiating with the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, or we should be negotiating with gangs in Medellin, in downtown, even though it's probably being done in many different ways. But I think it does suggest that we need to explore sort of the plethora, the plurality of different actors that are on the ground, and figure out ways that they can coordinate with each other, even if it's not the most politically expedient thing to do.
It's again difficult to kind of add or contribute to this conversation in the case of Venezuela because numbers are so untrustworthy. But I do think that there are a couple of reasons to believe that cases in Venezuela are lower than maybe in some other places, not because of effective implementation of a quarantine or a lockdown, but Maduro did shut the country down, their borders down, airports down very early on. And I think also, again, going back, it's just very difficult to understand anything going on in Venezuela without going back to at least the economic crisis. There's not a whole lot of travel going back and forth, into Venezuela. Whenever I would go back, the airport was just like surprisingly, there we go, empty. It was just insane in comparison to what I was used to. So I think those factors in some way worked the advantage of keeping cases somewhat lower. But again, with the number of people who've died from COVID and the number of people who have tested positive, I think we just have no idea about in that case. I did want to say, just thinking about, I think what Alberto and Eduardo were talking about, it's interesting to think about like what long-term research projects could come out of thinking about the pandemic. One of which being, I just automatically thought of like the long-term health consequences that people are going to be suffering, including gang members, including police officers, right? Like their ability to actually be able to move around and effectively engage in their work or whatever their responsibilities. So I think, considering just what the long-term health implications are going to be across a range of activities and spectrums is going to be really important once we start to see numbers declining.
Yeah, well, this have all been really interesting and important points. So I'm not sure. I would just add perhaps just one additional point to the crisis and dilemmas that you're referring to, Edgar, that yes, it's a health crisis. Yes, it's the security crisis that we already knew was ongoing, but this is putting the state in an even greater strain, right? That it's about, we know that, of course, organized crime, the state is a large part of it, but there's a level that it's about incentives and will, but it's also about capacity. And I think that minimal capacity that existed is now under greater strain, and that whenever we get out of this, it's going to be a greater challenge to address as Rebecca was saying, changes that we still don't know how they're gonna play out and how it's gonna affect in general police, criminals, society, but to attend on top of that already mounting challenges that the Latin American states were facing. So I think that is what's so worrisome about the current situation, and on how to attend the other multiple crises that we know had already been urgent across the region.
Well, with that, thanks so much, Alberto, Eduardo, Rebecca, Sandra, for this was fascinating conversation. And also, thanks so much for staying a little bit later. Also, to all the participants who also stayed a little bit longer. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I really hope we can keep doing this. And especially, as I said before, I hope that you can all come to the University of Michigan, to Ann Arbor, in a couple of years when things are more normal. You are always welcome. And with that, thank you so much, everybody.